I counted everything that autumn. Not in dollars, Lord. I hadn't seen real money since before Thomas died, but in what was left. Flour measured by the handful. Firewood stacked in days, not cords. And milk. Well, milk I counted in drops. That morning, the frost had come early, settled on the dead grass outside my door like white lace on a coffin. And I remember standing at the window thinking, this is it. This is the morning the land finally says what it's been whispering all along. You can't do this alone. Lucille. You never could. Eliza was crying. Not the loud, fat cry of a baby who's angry, no. This was the thin sound. The one that crawls under your ribs and nests there. The hungry cry. The one that means your body's failed at the one thing God designed it to do. I tried to feed her. I did. Sat in that cold rocker Thomas built and held her to me and nothing. My body had dried up same as the well out back. Same as the creek bed. Same as every promise this land ever made me. I had nothing left to give my daughter except the warmth of my arms. And honestly, some mornings even that felt borrowed. So I did what I'd been dreading for 3 weeks. I got us dressed. Now, I want you to understand something. I had a system. Even with nothing, I had a system. Eliza's clothes, what was left of them, I kept washed, mended. I'd torn my own petticoat for wrapping cloth, and I pressed it flat with a heated stone because I didn't own an iron anymore. I wrapped that baby so tight, so clean. You'd think she was, well, you'd think she belonged to someone who had more than I did. I put on my dress, the gray one, the only one, and I pulled my hair back, and I pinched my cheeks for color, straightened my collar twice, pressed my lips into a line so flat they couldn't tremble, adjusted Eliza's wrapping one final time, tucking the frayed edge underneath where nobody would see it. A woman walking into town to beg for milk still has a face to show the world. And I was building mine the way you build a wall piece by piece, with whatever's left. The walk was 3 miles, cold enough that my breath came out in little clouds that disappeared before I could count them. Eliza pressed against my chest, warm as a coal wrapped in cotton. And I kept my eyes on the road because if I looked at the fields, Thomas's fields, my fields, the ones that grew nothing but debt and then grief, I'd stop walking. And if I stopped walking, I'd sit down. And if I sat down, well, I reckon some women just don't get back up. The town grew closer. The mercantile door grew larger. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, practiced it like a schoolgirl with a recitation, standing in my kitchen at midnight with Eliza sleeping and my lips moving over the words, just a cup of milk, please. For the baby, I can work it off. I can sweep. I can mend. Begging has a script when you've still got dignity to lose. I reached the door, my hand on the cold handle, and I thought I remember this so clearly. I thought, what does a cup of milk cost when you're paying with the last of your pride? I pushed the door open. The bell rang. Every conversation in that mercantile stopped like I'd fired a pistol. I held Eliza tighter and stepped inside. The mercantile smelled like coffee and kerosene and dried apples, and I swear that smell nearly undid me faster than the silence did, because it smelled like plenty, like shelves full of things I couldn't buy, like other people's ordinary mornings. I walked to the counter. Mr. Hardin, the owner, was weighing flour for the preacher's wife, and he looked up at me the way you look at rain when you've already hung laundry, like I was an inconvenience timed badly. "Mr. Hardin," I said. Steady. I kept my voice steady, because if it cracked, I'd shatter, and I couldn't afford to shatter in front of, I counted, 6 people. "I was wondering if you could spare a cup of milk for the baby." Silence. The kind that has weight to it. The preacher's wife looked at me, then looked away. Mrs. Calloway, by the fabric bolts, suddenly found something real interesting about a spool of thread. And Mr. Hardin, he hesitated, glanced at his other customers like he was checking if charity was appropriate for the audience. That hesitation. I want you to understand what that pause cost me. Because in that pause, I was calculated, measured. Every woman in that store was already composing the version she'd tell over supper the Barnes widow came in begging today, baby on her hip, looking like something the cat dragged in, and I stood there and let them compose it because Eliza was hungry and my pride wasn't worth more than her crying. "I suppose I can manage that," Mr. Hardin said, like he was doing me the grandest favor in the territory. He poured it, a tin cup. I took it, and I fed Eliza right there at the counter because she couldn't wait. She couldn't. And the sound of my baby drinking was the loudest thing in that silent room. I didn't see him. Not really. A figure in the back, near the grain sacks, tall, loading supplies. I registered a shape. Nothing more. Didn't see him stop what he was doing. Didn't see him watching, not the spectacle, but the way I held that cup steady. The way I thanked Mr. Hardin without dropping my eyes. I didn't know Wyatt Colton was memorizing me like a passage in a book. I finished. I thanked the man. I walked out with nothing else. The walk home was longer, heavier, as if the milk I'd put in my daughter had been taken from my own bones. When I reached my gate, if you could call it that, I stopped. The fence leaned like a drunk man at every post, wire sagging to the ground, a boundary that couldn't keep anything in or out. Inside, I set Eliza in her crate, her crib. I called it a crib, and I picked up my broom, swept the floor that was already clean, because clean was the one thing that cost nothing. And I would not lose it. I survived it. That's what I told myself, sweeping in circles. Survived is enough. It had to be. Next morning, I was on the porch sweeping again. Because honestly, what else did I have when I heard hoofbeats? Not the casual amble of a neighbor passing, purposeful, coming up my road. I stopped sweeping, held the broom like a rifle, which probably looked as foolish as it sounds. He dismounted. Tall man, clean hat, but worn at the brim. Boots that had seen real work despite, well, I'd learned this later despite having enough money to buy boots every week for a century. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, name's Wyatt Colton." I knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Colton cattle, Colton land, Colton money. My spine went so stiff I thought it might snap. "I know who you are," I said, and I waited for it, the coin toss, the pitying head tilt. The poor dear. Let me help you. That really means let me feel good about myself at your expense. But he didn't. He didn't do that. He looked around. Slow. Deliberate. The way Thomas used to read soil, not glancing, but studying. His eyes moved over my porch, my door, through the window to the shelves I'd organized with the precision of a woman who controlled the only things she could. He saw the mended baby clothes on the line, tiny garments, patched and repatched, but clean. Lord, they were clean. He looked at all of it the way a cattleman reads land. And I watched him reading me and I thought, what is he looking for, ma'am? He said, I got a business proposition. Not charity, not an offering, a proposition. 5 dairy cows, supplies for a barn, contract to buy your milk at fair price, same price I paid the Henderson Dairy. Not a cent less. Profits are yours. I stared at him, searched his face for the trap, the angle, the part where this turned into what I expected. Why me? Mister, you don't know me from Adam. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and these words changed my life more than any wedding vow or funeral prayer ever did, he said, because a woman who keeps house this clean when everything's fallen apart will run a tight operation. I didn't say yes. I want you to know that. I didn't just fall at his feet in gratitude. I told him I'd think on it, because I needed to own even that pause, the pause between being offered something and accepting it. That pause was mine. He nodded. Fair enough. Mounted his horse. Rode away without looking back. I stood on that porch, shaking, and it was not from cold. Inside, Eliza babbled at nothing, the way babies do, and I whispered through the door, your mama might be a fool, baby girl, but she might just be a dairy woman. They arrived on a Tuesday. 5 Jersey cows with brown eyes so gentle and deep, I named every one of them before sundown, which, looking back, was probably the moment I stopped surviving and started building. Though I didn't know it at the time. Bess, Clara, Penny, Dot, and the smallest one, the shy one who hung back from the others, I called her Hope. And I didn't realize why until much later. The work nearly killed me. I mean that. Almost literally. First morning, I sat on the milking stool and put my hands on Bess, and she kicked the pail clean across the barn. Milk everywhere. My only pail dented. My hip bruised purple where the stool caught me falling. I sat in the hay and the spilled milk and I thought, this is it. This is God laughing at the woman who said she'd be a dairy woman. But I got up, tried again. Bess kicked again. I tried a third time, talking low, the way Thomas used to talk to horses. And this time she let me. My hands shook so badly the first streams missed the pail entirely. But I learned. My fingers blistered the first week, bled the second. I milked through the bleeding because milk doesn't wait for your hands to heal. By the third week, the blisters had become calluses. And those calluses, listen, this might sound strange. Those calluses were the first things I'd owned in over a year that felt like they meant something. My back ached so deep some nights I couldn't straighten up to lift Eliza from her crib. My arms trembled, spooning her porridge. I fell asleep standing once, forehead against Penny's warm flank, and woke with the pail half full and my knees locked stiff. But the rhythm found me. Squeeze, pull, release. Warm milk hitting the cold pail, steam rising like tiny prayers. And the sound that steady hiss, hiss, hiss into the tin became the heartbeat of my new life. Wyatt sent a ranch hand, a quiet boy named Samuel, to help raise the barn. But Wyatt himself didn't come. Not at first. He gave me space. And I didn't understand that gift until later. Most men would have shown up daily, checked their investment, reminded you who owned what. Wyatt let me own it. When he did come end of the second week, to settle the first delivery contract he didn't inspect, he asked, "How's the yield?" Like I was a partner giving a report, not a charity case being supervised. I told him, 12 gallons a day. 3 ranches interested. He nodded, slow, and I watched his face, the way his eyes softened at the corners, the way he turned his hat brim once in his hands before setting it back on his head. He didn't say he was pleased. He didn't have to. Then he looked at Eliza sitting in a basket I'd set by the barn door, and he tipped his hat to her, tipped his hat to a baby, like she was a lady deserving of courtesy. I don't know why that undid me more than the cows, but it did. That evening, between milkings, I went to the fence, the broken one. I grabbed the post that leaned the worst, and I straightened it, packed the dirt around it with my bare, calloused hands. One post, just one, but it was mine. My hands, my labor, my fence. Eliza crawled to Bess in the yard, patted her leg, and laughed. I laughed too, and honestly, I barely recognized the sound. It was the evening he brought the first month's payment that things shifted between us in a way I wasn't prepared for. He came by after supper. The payment was fair, exactly what he'd promised. Not a cent of charity hidden in the numbers. I checked. I always checked. He knew I checked, and he never once seemed offended by it. "Coffee?" I asked, because it seemed like the thing a business partner does when the other partner rides 3 miles at dusk to deliver payment in person. He said yes. We sat at my table, Thomas's table, the one thing the creditors hadn't taken because it was too heavy to move, and we drank coffee and the quiet settled around us like a quilt. I talked more than I intended. That's the dangerous thing about silence shared with someone who doesn't fill it with noise. It makes you want to pour yourself into the space. I told him about Thomas. Not the dying, everyone already knew that part, but the after. The creditors who came before the body was cold. The farm that failed because drought doesn't mourn. The walk to the mercantile with an empty body and a hungry baby, and the specific mathematics of asking for help in a room full of people who'd rather watch you drown than get their hands wet. I stopped mid-sentence, horrified, because I'd shown him. God, I'd shown him everything. The empty cupboards of my heart laid out on the table between our coffee cups. I waited for pity, braced for it. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, and this is what changed things. This is the moment he told me about his house. The big one everyone in town admired. 12 rooms, he said, staring into his cup. Built every one of them furnished them too. And there ain't a single soul waiting in any of 'em when I come home at night." He turned the cup in his hands. "I got a house. Ma'am, you got a home. I reckon I know which one's worth more." I didn't know what to say to that. A rich man calling my shack a home. But he wasn't mocking me, I could see it in his eyes. He was showing me his empty rooms the way I'd shown him my empty cupboards. Even trade. Eliza fell asleep between us, just drifted off on the blanket by the stove. And the sound of her breathing was so peaceful it hurt. I noticed my shoulders had dropped. The tension I'd been carrying for months, maybe a year, had released. And I could feel its absence the way you feel a tooth that's been pulled. Something that was always there, suddenly gone. After he left, I touched the coffee cup he'd used, didn't wash it, set it beside mine on the shelf. 2 cups, side by side. Such a small thing, such an enormous thing. The dairy was thriving, 3 ranches supplied, quality consistent, and I carried myself taller. I could feel it in my spine. This new straightness, like the fence posts I'd been mending one by one. Then I walked into the feed store and the world reminded me where I came from. I heard it before I saw who was speaking. Mrs. Hardin, the mercantile owner's wife. The same woman who'd watched me beg for milk, her voice carrying clear as a church bell from behind the seed display. She begged for milk in October and got a whole dairy by Christmas. Must be nice to have that kind of arrangement. Laughter. Soft, covered mouth laughter. The kind women use when they're cutting you to pieces and want to pretend they're being delicate about it. Shame doesn't announce itself. It just waits, patient as a rattlesnake in tall grass. And right there in that feed store aisle, holding a 50-pound bag of grain I was buying with money I earned from milk. I pulled at 4 a.m. from cows I tended with blistered, bleeding, calloused hands that rattlesnake struck. I felt the rags on my skin again. Despite the new dress, despite the calluses, despite every gallon and every mended fence post, and every dawn I dragged myself out of bed to build something from nothing. They didn't attack Wyatt. That's what I noticed. Nobody questioned his judgment, his charity, his motives. No, it was me they sharpened their teeth on. The widow, the beggar, the woman who must have traded something for those cows, because how else does a woman in rags end up with a dairy I paid for my grain? Walked out. Didn't cry. I want you to know that. I did not give them that. But I pulled back from Wyatt, canceled our Thursday meeting, told Samuel to tell him the weather was too bad for deliveries. It wasn't the weather, and we both knew it wasn't the weather. But I couldn't face him while those whispers were still echoing in my ears. I looked at my fence that evening, half rebuilt now, posts straight, wire tightening, and I wondered, honestly wondered if some boundaries are just invitations for people to notice what's behind them. I thought about returning the cows, ending the contract, going back to what? Counting in drops. At least nobody whispered about a woman with nothing. She was invisible. And invisible didn't hurt. Couldn't sleep. The whispers followed me home and set up camp in my skull. And by midnight, I was in the barn with a lantern because at least the cows didn't have opinions about my arrangement with Wyatt Colton. Bess stood patient while I milked her. My hands worked automatic squeeze, pull, release while my mind spiraled like water down a drain. I was afraid. and not of poverty I'd survived poverty. Poverty was familiar, almost comfortable in its predictability. No, I was afraid of something worse. I was afraid of owing. Because belief can be given and belief can be taken away. And if Wyatt Colton woke up tomorrow and decided I wasn't worth the investment, then what? Then I was a woman with 5 cows that weren't hers, and a barn she didn't build, and a reputation that said she'd sold something other than milk to get them. The town's voice in my head, and honestly, it sounded a lot like Mrs. Hardin said, "A woman in rags doesn't become a dairy woman. The distance between begging for milk and selling it is a fairy tale. And fairy tales are for children." Lucille. I set down the pail, pressed my forehead against Bess's warm flank, listened to her heartbeat because mine was beating too fast. The lantern flickered in the draft, and the shadows moved like doubts shifting, growing, pressing in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe the smart thing, the safe thing was to give it all back. Go quiet. Disappear into the kind of poverty nobody bothers to gossip about because it's too ordinary to notice. I sat there. I sat in that barn with the straw scratching my ankles and the smell of warm milk and hay, and I let the doubt have me. I let it sit on my chest and press down, and I didn't fight it. For 5 minutes, maybe 10. I let myself feel the full weight of what it would mean to quit. Then Eliza cried from the house. Not the thin cry, no, not anymore. A loud cry, an angry cry, the cry of a baby who's been fed enough to have the strength for outrage, who wants her mama right now. Thank you very much. I walked through the cold darkness, picked her up. She grabbed my braid, something new, something she'd just learned, and held on with both fists, pulled hard enough to hurt. And I laughed, because my daughter had learned to hold on. I carried her to the porch, looked back at the barn, small, rough built, but real. The milk in those pails was real. The calluses on my hands were real. The 3 ranches waiting for delivery at dawn were real. The money in the tin box under my bed, my money, earned, counted, mine that was real. The whispers were just air, just hot air from cold hearts. And I'd survived worse weather than that. I set Eliza on my hip, walked back into the barn, picked up the pail I'd put down, wrapped my calloused fingers around the handle and lifted it, and I finished the milking. Every last cow, because that's what a dairy woman does. I set the lantern on the porch rail after. It glowed against the dark, small, steady, stubborn, like me. Valentine's morning. I want to tell you about Valentine's morning. I woke at 4, same as always. Milked all 5 girls. Loaded the wagon Eliza bundled beside me, babbling at the cold air like it was telling her jokes. Made my deliveries. 3 ranches. On time. Full measure. Quality that nobody could question. And then I did something I'd been planning for 2 weeks. I took my best jar, the glass one with the tight lid that Thomas's mother had given us for our wedding, and I washed it twice. Dried it with a clean cloth, held it up to the light to check for smudges. Then I filled it with the finest cream I'd ever skimmed, thick as velvet, rich enough to make a preacher forget his sermon. Then I took my ribbon, and I want you to understand about this ribbon. It was blue satin, the only pretty thing I still owned. Thomas bought it for my hair the first year we were married, and I'd kept it through everything, through the funeral, through the creditors, through the rags and the begging and the counting in drops. I'd kept it because a woman needs one beautiful thing, even when, especially when everything else is ugly. I held it for a long moment, ran it through my fingers, felt the smoothness of it, such a strange texture after months of rough wood and cowhide and cracked leather. Then I wrapped it around that jar. Slow, careful, tied it in a bow the way my mother taught me, the kind with 2 even loops and tails that hang straight, like I was wrapping a piece of myself around a piece of what I'd built. Then I wrote the note. Took me 6 tries, 6 sheets of paper I couldn't really spare. Each one started and scratched out and crumpled because the words wouldn't. They wouldn't line up with what I felt. Finally, on the 7th, you didn't save me, Mr. Colton. You believed in me. That's worth more than all your gold. I rode to his house. And listen, I'd never been there before. 12 rooms, he'd said. 12 rooms and nobody in them. The porch was wide and clean and so empty it echoed. And I understood in that moment exactly what he'd meant about my shack being a home. I dismounted, carried the jar with both hands, Thomas's mother's jar, my cream, my ribbon, my words, and I set it on his porch, right by the door where he'd find it first thing. Tucked the note under the ribbon, pressed it flat with my thumb, stood there for 1 breath. 2, felt the weight of what I was doing, not giving a gift, but declaring something, declaring that I had enough now to give back, that the woman who begged for a cup of milk could now leave cream on a rich man's porch and mean it. I rode away before he could read it. This was my choice. A woman who has nothing can accept charity. But only a woman who has built something can offer a gift and mean it with her whole chest. I rode home past my fence. Every post straight, wire taut, pulled tight by my hands over months of mornings. I built that boundary. I chose who enters. Eliza was laughing when I walked through the door. Fat, loud, fed. The sound of a baby who doesn't know what hunger means anymore. That sound, that laugh was the only review that mattered. Spring came like an apology, slow and gentle, like the land was saying sorry for the winter. Here's what I meant to give you all along. Green crept back into the fields. The creek filled, and my dairy ran tight as a church clock. I'd added a room to the shack by then, paid for with milk money, built by Samuel and 2 hands I hired, with my own wages, and Eliza had a proper room with a proper window and a crib that wasn't a crate. I painted it white with paint I bought at the mercantile, and Mr. Hardin rang it up without a word, without a glance. Because I paid in cash, and cash doesn't require commentary. Wyatt came by on a Tuesday evening. We'd settled into a rhythm by then, not romantic, not yet, but something that lived in the space between business partner and, something warm, something patient. Something that understood you can't rush a woman who's been counting in drops. He sat at my table, Thomas's table, our table. Maybe I was still deciding about that, and he was still letting me decide. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out my note, the one I'd left with the cream. And Lord, it was worn, creased and soft from handling. from being read and reread and folded and unfolded until the paper was almost cloth. Carried it every day since Valentine's. He said, quiet, like he was confessing something. I waited. You wrote that I believed in you. He said, that it was worth more than my gold. He looked at me, really looked. The way he'd looked at my shelves that first morning, reading me, and he said, no, ma'am. You saved me from being just a rich man with nothing to show for it. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. But I felt something shift. Something final. Like the last fence post clicking into place. I poured him coffee. We sat in the quiet. Eliza toddled between us, walking now, sturdy on her fat legs. 8 months of good milk and a mama who wasn't hollowed out anymore, and she grabbed Wyatt's finger and held it with both fists, the same way she'd grabbed my braid that midnight in the barn. She held on like she'd decided something, and he let her, and that was enough. For now, for this season, enough. I think about it sometimes, what he really gave me. And it wasn't 5 cows or barn supplies or a contract at fair price, though Lord knows those things saved my life. What he gave me was, he gave me back my own reflection. He saw a woman with clean shelves and empty cupboards, and he said, that's not failure. That's readiness. I was never broken. I want you to hear that. I was never, ever broken. I was a woman with a system and no resources. A dairy farmer with no cows. A mother with no milk. Every skill was there, packed tight inside me like seeds in frozen ground. All I needed was one person to look past the rags and see the rose. I'm sitting on my porch now. Dawn. Eliza on my hip, heavy. So heavy. And I love the weight of her. 5 brown cows behind a mended fence, grazing in spring grass. The barn stands solid. The house stands straight. And me, I stand, too. He didn't give me a life. He gave me back the one I already had, and I built it into something neither of us expected. I used to count in drops. Now I count in mornings. In the weight of a growing daughter on a hip that doesn't ache anymore. In fence posts I straightened with my own 2 hands. In cups of coffee shared across a table with a man who saw me before I could see myself. That's worth more than all his gold. Honestly, it's worth more than all of mine.